Obviously, the LNG Canada project is symbolic in a number of ways. It shows that you can get a major resource project approved in Canada. It shows that Canada is open for business, for foreign investors, and that we're working to expand our global trading relationships beyond the obvious partner to the south. But at the same time, we still have steel aluminum tariffs imposed by the U.S. We have a trade deal that doesn't guarantee that the U.S. will not use tariffs in the future as a weapon of trade to get what it wants. Are you confident that you now have the kind of investment climate that lifts that cloud that's been hanging over us for all this time?
Well, I think certainly having established the USMC as an element of continued access to the most important market in the world for Canada is a big thing that I'd heard from CEOs around the country and around the world, actually. The uncertainty around NAFTA was at least something that they brought up, whether it was a direct challenge to investing. And having that off the table as a concern is a very big thing. The other thing with the LNG investment is it actually, and it's been in the works through many governments over many years, but ultimately it is a concrete illustration of the argument that we've been making for 3 years, that if you want to get a big project done and be safe from court challenges and get that public support for it, you need to be really thoughtful about environmental impacts and about Indigenous partnership. And that's something that LNG Canada has absolutely done right.
Well, before we return to the pipeline question, just on NAFTA for a minute, what lessons did you learn from that negotiation about how to deal with the Trump administration?
I don't know. And over the past couple of weeks, I've spoken with a number of world leaders who've asked me to help them sort of look at what tricks or what approaches might be. And all I said is we have privately, and I've said it publicly, we took an approach that was constructive, always looking for common ground, always willing to be flexible and patient at the table as we try to be creative around stumbling blocks, but at the same time be absolutely unequivocal and firm that we are not going to accept a bad deal for Canada. And I don't know how long you guys had to, how many times you guys had to put up with hearing me repeat that over and over again, which doesn't necessarily make for good copy, but that did make it very, very clear to the Americans that we wanted a deal. We were doing this in good faith, but we were only going to accept a deal that was the right one for Canada.
There is still some uncertainty, right? You have an administration that's fond of using tariffs as a weapon to get leverage. Mm-hmm. Barry mentioned aluminum and steel. So how much certainty does this actually give us on autos, steel, issues like that?
Let's talk about those three issues then. On aluminum and steel, we recognize that we are going to continue to push and work with them to try and figure out a way to stop both those tariffs and the countervailing tariffs that we've seen recently have certainly had something of a political impact. To hear my friend Matt Bevin, the governor of Kentucky, sort of expressing how much of an irritant they were. We agree it would be much better to have no tariffs on either side on any of these things, and that's very much what we're going to keep working for and towards. On the issue of 232 on autos, we got an agreement that allows us, even if the Trump administration moves forward with 232 on autos, we have a quota cap that is significantly larger than Canada has ever produced in terms of autos. So not only are we protected from 232 on autos, but we can continue to grow our auto industry with significant new investments, even under 232 on autos. And thirdly, on 232 on anything else, we've got a particular Canada exemption that means that when they move forward with 232 on anything around the world, Canada gets, I think it's 60 days of negotiating time, because as they've recognized, dealing with Canada is very different than dealing with the rest of the world. So I think we have exactly gotten a significant number of protections from what is, we'll all admit it, a bit of a challenging administration to deal with on trade.
One of the lessons of the past year and a half, the challenging negotiation on trade, is that a realization that Canada really needs to be less reliant on one customer for its products. And as you know, China, the world's #2 economy, has expressed interest in restarting trade negotiations. What is our response going to be? And if we engage with them, how can Canada do that without sacrificing some of the values that Canadians are concerned about, be they on free market, it's on human rights, on national security?
That's not a new question. That's always been the dynamic we've had when we've engaged with China. The choice of, whether or not to engage, and if we engage, trying to make sure that human rights, that the values that are important to Canadians are also stood up for, while at the same time we create prosperity and opportunity. But if you want to talk about diversifying our trade, that's certainly something that Andy has been very busy with in bringing in 5 of the biggest Asian companies into investing in Canada, right?
Barry, the trade flow between Canada and China and Korea and Japan, those are the 3 countries absorb about 55% of global LNG trade, will make a huge difference also in terms of the bilateral and multilateral agendas. Every cargo that leaves this country is worth about 50 million, and every second day a cargo will leave. And if you multiply the two, you get $9 billion worth of new Canadian value added to Canadian resources. But what is also important is that by bringing, in this case, PetroChina into Canada, it means that PetroChina invests 15% of the total capital that is involved in Energy Canada. It helps them as part of their internal reform process as they become part of an international venture to change the company. And as such, it is a fantastic opportunity for a different dialogue between the 2 countries.
Have you responded to the Chinese? Will we be re-engaging? What kind of timing will that take? And how, given the United States' efforts to try and rein in some of the Chinese trade practices around the world, how does that dovetail with helping them, approach the Chinese? Can we be in negotiations with the Chinese on a free trade agreement while also having this parallel track of countries getting together?
Well, as you said, China is the 2nd largest economy in the world, and on a growing trajectory. It means that the question is, how do we, not whether we engage with them, but how we best engage with them. And certainly discussions are continuing with China on moving forward on various trade opportunities. I think we've all recognized that diversifying our trade is extremely important, and we're happy to continue to engage with the Chinese. There's no question about that, but we have to be very thoughtful about the way we do that, and not for external reasons, but for our own internal reasons and values. We know there are real challenges involved in trade with China, and being alert to those and thoughtful about those is completely logical.
So is that no, not right now? Is that the answer to the Chinese, or?
No, it is. Let's talk about where we can work together in areas that make sense for both of us that will benefit Canadians.
In the long run, can you do a meaningful deal with China on trade and stay on side the trade relationship with this U.S. administration that's very hawkish on China?
Well, I mean, they put forward a proposal in the USMC originally that was very, very rigid on trade with China. We got them to a place where we agree to mutually discuss trade negotiations we might make with China, which is positive for us. It's something we would have done anyway, but not necessarily something Americans would have done were they engaging in trade discussions with China. They might not have been filling in Canada, and now because of the USMC, they will. These are the kinds of things that we're being thoughtful about, and certainly we understand that the importance of maintaining a positive trade relationship with the United States is at the top of our list of priorities, but diversifying and continuing to diversify our trade is obviously a continued priority.
One of the key security issues that's come up recently is Huawei and which countries will and won't allow them into 5G. How can the government of Canada allow Huawei to be part of Canada's 5G when countries like the US and Australia have said that that's too risky?
First of all, we make our decisions based on evidence, based on the recommendations of our extraordinarily effective communications security establishment. We listen to them. It's very easy in discussions like this to let politics slip into decisions and positioning like that. And as I've been saying for more than 3 years, we try and base our decisions on evidence and data, and that means listening to the experts and trusting them.
Mr. Kalitz, you've come closer than anybody has to getting a pipeline approved and done, and we'll start building it. It's been years since a project has come this close. The man to your left represents a government that bought Trans Mountain a number of months ago. What advice do you have toward getting First Nations and other groups on side with these sorts of huge projects?
Derek, just a reminder, Energy Canada is about an upstream development and a pipeline to be built by TransCanada Pipelines called Coastal GasLink, and an LNG facility and an export port and a set of ships to take it to Asia. I won't offer the Prime Minister any advice, but what was absolutely key to our development and which got this across the line was the early engagement. We started this project in 2010 already. And 8 years later, the early engagement with First Nations before we submitted our project descriptions, and also very importantly dealing with the marine considerations. The beautiful British Columbia demands that marine considerations be thoroughly dealt with, and all the way from Kitimat to Prince Rupert and beyond, we considered that fully. And we'll gladly sit down with the new owners of the Trans Mountain Pipeline and immediately share those lessons that we learned over an 8-year period, which constituted 17,000 engagements mostly with First Nations, but with regulators. But it also, in our case, led to first-time approval, on-time approval of all the permits that we required for the plant and for the pipeline.
And that's actually at the core of what we're putting forward with C69, the early consultations, that recognition that the way to get these things built is to work with Indigenous peoples on partnerships in a respectful and thoughtful way, and to work with the environmental science and scientists to make sure that we're minimizing potential impacts. That's exactly what the Federal Court of Appeals came back and said we need to do more of. That's exactly what we're going to be doing. But that's also at the heart of C69, which is this bill that will not just create a framework for investors to be able to know how their projects will be approved on time and properly, but it also is a demonstration that we get that the only way to do these things and to protect ourselves and investors from the lawsuits that inevitably come up when corners are cut or things are overridden, as the previous Conservative government did. This is the way to get things built on an ongoing basis without having to do one-offs like a piece of legislation through the House anytime you want a particular investment, which seems to be the argument some folks tend to be making.
Your government came into office with this sort of grand bargain between the environment and resource development, that trade-off between carbon pricing, having proper evaluation of projects, and then getting the projects actually built. Is that, you've got a province that's opposing Trans Mountain, you've got now several provinces that are resisting the carbon pricing. Is that bargain still possible in the current environment, and how do you overcome that?
Not only is it still possible, it's still essential. I haven't met many Canadians that have actually said, you know what, we do want to make a choice between what's good for the economy or what's good for the environment. Every single person I've ever spoken to at the highest or most basic level wants us both to protect our environment for future generations and create good jobs now and into the future. So doing those two things together is no longer a debate for me. And unfortunately, we have people both on the left and on the right who've picked one side and are trying to sit on it. But if there's one thing that the LNG Canada investment shows, is that doing both of those is integral to that.
And let me also comment from an investor point of view. That sustainability of the environment, the consultation with First Nations and economic development is the formula that whether you're investing in Canada or in Mozambique or in Indonesia, one needs to find a formula to go forward with. For all five the joint ventures in LNG Canada, Shell, Petronas, PetroChina, KOGAS, Mitsubishi, they all five factored a carbon tax in Canada as part of their economics. I and LNG Canada support an LNG Canada a carbon tax in Canada.
Would the government of Canada support putting, a bit of a shift of gears here, but putting Magnitsky-type sanctions on the Saudi royal family if they are found to have been involved in Jamal Khashoggi's death? I
mean, first of all, as I've said, we are certainly concerned with some of the reports and allegations that have come around throughout the situation. We're going to work with our allies. We're going to make sure that we're moving forward in a thoughtful, responsible way, and we will look at the tools we might have to use down the line. As you know, we are in a bit of a strained relationship with Saudi Arabia right now, and we continue to engage with them diplomatically to try and reduce those the concerns that people have. But we're going to remain, as I've said, every time anyone has asked me about relations with Saudi Arabia, we're going to remain firm on our defense of rights and values and the rule of law, and that's not going to change.
And those tools could include sanctions against individuals,
I think
bans on future arms sales?
We're a long way from actually looking at what tools we have. We're still trying to figure out what actually happened.
On the question of pipelines and Trans Mountain specifically, if it comes to having to physically remove protesters or opponents of the pipelines of that particular project from construction sites, how far is the government of Canada willing to go?
First of all, we have always defended the rights of Canadians to protest. I think it's extremely important that we value and we allow Canadians to express themselves. And one of the things that we saw quite a bit under the previous government, who categorized protesters as terrorists on a number of occasions, that actually didn't have the desired effect for the previous government, did it? It not only did it anger the folks who were protesting, but it made all Canadians very worried about the extent to which the previous government was actually interested in getting public license for big projects or bringing people along in significant investments. I think there will always be people who disagree with a given project whenever you talk about anything of scale, anything that matters. The important thing is to make sure that they are heard, but make sure that the law is respected, that we are a country of the rule of law, and whether it's Parliament or the courts or what have you, it's important that those laws be followed. But it certainly doesn't mean any draconian actions. It means keeping in mind that people are exercising a really important democratic right to express their disapproval of a given decision.
Are you comfortable with the idea that protesters may have to be physically removed in order for the government to
I think there are many examples in recent history in which protesters have had to be removed from various protest sites where it was done in a proper and respectful way that didn't have a breakdown of the social fabric. And I think that's certainly something that we want to make sure that people understand, that we very much respect their right to express themselves loudly and clearly in their disagreements, but that we are ultimately a country of the rule of law, and that law needs to be followed.
This is obviously a really big week for cannabis in Canada. Polls suggest that a lot of Canadians are pretty nervous about what the fallout is going to be coming forward. Do you worry that, given the sort of your personal engagement in this, your government's engagement in this, that it becomes you are blamed for everything that might happen remotely related to cannabis over the next couple of years?
with the opposition I have, I'm used to being blamed for anything that goes wrong anytime. So that's sort of something I put to the side. I think we have to remember that the reason we're moving forward on controlling and regulating cannabis is because we have right now a failure of public policy. We are unable to protect our kids, where Canadian young people have the highest rate of marijuana usage of any of 29 different developed countries, according to a UN study. And secondly, we're funding organized crime and criminal gangs to the tune of about $6 billion a year. This current prohibition has not worked, and that's why 3 years ago we came forward with concrete plans to do this. We have worked with the provinces throughout. Even since royal assent, we asked the provinces how much time they'd need to bring in their solutions. They said anything from 6 to 12 weeks. Well, we've actually given them 15, 16, 17 weeks. We are working with them. Obviously, this is a big change in policy that is going to have hiccups and challenges, and we are working to minimize those. I think people will understand that this is something that we are doing in a very thoughtful way, that is going to do a better job of protecting our kids and of defunding the criminals who are making exorbitant amounts of money off it now.
On environment policy, are you, and it is related to the pipeline question, are you heading for the same sort of protracted legal confrontation on carbon pricing with a number of provinces now challenging you that you had on the pipelines themselves?
I don't think so. And I think the reason for it is Canadians are fairly unequivocal that they want real action on protecting future generations from the impact of climate change. Canadians know that this is something that matters. So when even the Conservatives are saying that yes, they understand climate change is real and it's a challenge and they're going to reach their Paris targets, Canadians rightly are going to be asking them, well, how are you going to reach your targets? And the fact that the Conservatives will not say how they're going to reach their targets, will not put forward some sort of a plan, is something that is quite patently transparent to most Canadians as folks who are not serious about actually doing anything about protecting us from climate change.
Within the province of British Columbia, where Energy Canada will be accommodated in full, we've supported the carbon tax, which was already implemented by the previous governments. We will pay that. We see that as part of doing business in Canada, part of doing business in British Columbia, but also, more importantly, it's part of one of the key mechanisms of dealing with global climate change in future. And so British Columbia and Energy Canada supports moving ahead with a carbon tax.
Yeah, businesses understand you put a price on pollution. Don't make pollution free. And that's exactly what we're going to ensure is done right across the country.
And interestingly enough, we had to do that within the context of being globally competitive also against jurisdictions that doesn't have it. And that's a bold statement for me to then say that. But we've accommodated in our economics, as I've indicated earlier, for the final investment decision.
Thanks so much for doing this.
Thank you, guys.